Greetings, friends. You are on the channel Military Reports. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 17th of June, 2024 year. There have been a lot of changes today. There are interesting, let's say, adjustments on the map. So let's get started. We will start with you from the Kharkiv direction, where the most interesting event is developing in the area of the settlement of Glubokaya. As you can see, we have corrected the map and painted most of the village of Glubokaya itself, as well as fields. Forest belts around the village in gray, which indicates that this territory is currently at least contested. The thing is that today Russian sources have published at least two videos from this direction. All the footage was published by the official Telegram channels of the grouping of troops of the north, or channels close to, let's say, military units. In these frames, for example, we can observe with you how a Ukrainian armored personnel carrier was destroyed as a result of a Lancet strike. And as you can see, the place was naturally geolocated. The footage is naturally fresh. As you can see from these shots, the armored personnel carrier was destroyed in this area. And of course, the question immediately arises, how did the Ukrainian armored personnel carrier end up here? If we turn to the summary of his North group, they really confirm that there were some attempts to counterattack again from the AFU in the Gluboko area, but all attacks were repulsed, armored personnel carriers were destroyed, and the AFU lost their, let's say, suffered losses in personnel. And again, the question arises whether the Russian units have managed to regain control, or whether the AFU is still located along these forest belts. And the answer to this question came a little later. Also, Russian sources published footage of the assault actions of Russian units in the Gluboko area, or rather attempts to dislodge the AFU, who landed on that armored personnel carrier within the boundaries of the village itself. In these frames, apparently, you have 4 or 5 Russian attack aircraft with you, who are trying to shoot and suppress the AFU positions at a distance in the basement of a building that was deployed, let's say, in the northern part of Volchanskaya. There was an AFU fighter standing here, and Russian soldiers stormed him. So, based on these frames, it can be assumed that there really was an attack from the AFU. So far, it is very difficult to say that the attack just choked and the Ukrainians failed to achieve any tasks. It is very difficult to say what goals to achieve. In other words, while we keep the territory in a gray zone, we need more personnel, more information, in order to restore control of Russian units and either paint the territory yellow. The only thing that is important to note are 2 points. The official Telegram channel of the Group of Troops of the North reports about the defeat of the AFU in these next attempts of the offensive. But Ukrainian sources literally before the moment when the recording of this video began to spread information that there would be garnishes, navins on the Viny from the Gluboko side. In other words, the press information has begun, the preparation of society, for some possible tactical or operational success in this direction. But again, we still don't know about what kind of new products, so we are waiting. Perhaps more details will be received in the near future, perhaps by the next video, we will have accurately adjusted the map. And there are also reports continue to arrive that the AFU is still accumulating forces, and continues to accumulate further in the Lipsovsky direction. In other words, really all these events around the Gluboko area are really the beginning of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The counteroffensive is being conducted and the main goal is to squeeze out Russian units from both that deep, from the same Lukinsov. But here we clearly understand that at the moment a month has passed since Gluboko practically came under the full control of Russian units. During this whole month, the Russian side has been building fortifications, digging in, bringing, let's say, infrastructure. And now the Russian side is on the defensive. And of course, it is easy and natural to defend all attempts to counterattack from the AFU. They will most likely be associated with high losses. But in general, we are already beginning to receive information every day, to receive details that 1-2-1 Battalion has already suffered some critical losses there. Gradually, the first units that met the Russian army, say, at the beginning of May, are already being brought out for replenishment before staffing. Then we are moving with you to Volchansk. There is also a lot of news, a huge number of geolocations, as you can see. Let's start, of course, with the most important news that comes from the aggregate plant itself. Several independent sources almost simultaneously confirmed the information that the Russian country managed to fully establish control over the aggregate plant itself. In other words, this information was received literally at different times from various independent sources. But so far we keep the territory in a gray zone, since there was no official confirmation, the first and the second. There was no geolocation that could confirm this control. In turn, the last day the settlement was shelled by massive air strikes with sunbursts, multiple launch rocket systems. That is, the Ukrainian positions are under sweaty fire control, but it cannot be said that the Ukrainians are on the defensive. They are trying to counterattack. So far, if we talk about Severny Volchansk itself, it is difficult to understand what they really want to achieve exactly in the citadel area of the same aggregate plant. It was repeatedly reported about some kind of environment there, which actually did not exist. The expansion of the control zone in the citadel area, and other moments. But it is worth noting other information. This is that at the moment, the USU continues to concentrate its forces in the area of the village of Tikaya. And it's not that they continue to concentrate, but they are already beginning attempts to counterattack the Russian opposition in eastern Volchansk. For example, in these frames we can observe with you a very important moment. An attempt to transfer the AFU units from Yuzhny and Volchansk to Severny Volchansk. However, this attempt was unsuccessful. Ukrainian units were detected, and during a mortar strike, or an artillery strike, an attempt to rotate or reinforce was thwarted. This strike was deployed in this area. Why are these frames important? First of all, we must clearly understand with you that there is a whole Volchansk. There are Ukrainian units in the private sector. In the citadel, there is some talk of an attempt by Ukraine to counterattack. And we must understand with you that the only option is how to throw. In other words, it is impossible to counterattack with light infantry units. But perhaps even within the city limits, you can move from one building to another, and then without the support of armor. It is very difficult to move even among dense residential developments. Therefore, and all the bridges have been destroyed, all the rivers, all the crossings, the entire Volcha River is under full control and drones. That is, in order to maintain some kind of, say, resource, infantry units are constantly being transferred to Volchansk, to the southernmost part, like in the Megabank area and Cafe Nick, firmware in general. Ukrainians are firing machine gun fire at possible supply routes for Russian units in the aggregate plant, and so on and so forth. And the main Ukrainian forces have been concentrated in the area of the village of Tikaya for the last few weeks. And today, some cartographers are already reporting, so far without geolocation, confirming this information, that the AFU unit completely controls the village of Tikaya, and is currently preparing or is already beginning to attempt a counteroffensive in the direction of eastern Volchansk. Here is such a one, along such a trajectory. The thing is that, again, I repeat, only an infantry unit can be transferred from the south to the north. Heavy equipment can be transferred a little to the east, in the Pacific region, where it has been concentrated in recent days. And now the main task, the priority task for the SSU, is to restore control over this Siglan pipe. Here there is some kind of chalk quarry, which, under the control of Russian units at altitude, and in case of restoration of control, and squeezing out of Russian units in the future, they can resume the supply route, the supply road, and, in general, continue, let's say, the fighting for northern Volchansk. And perhaps they will be held, and, as it were, defended. If the Russian units manage to repel the attacks all the way up, then well, the question of North Volchansk you will be. It's only a matter of time before they will be able to Russian units or not. But I repeat again, the counteroffensive is already underway. A large-scale counteroffensive is underway. Russian units are still holding back the pressure of Ukrainian units in eastern Volchansk, but, despite the fact that everything is still being repulsed, 6 have already begun. The 36th Brigade of the AFU Marines publish footage, take At least the author of this video claims that in the footage, we see with you the capture of a Russian soldier in this particular area. It is not yet clear how he got here. Perhaps he was brought here by a drone during, let's say, some kind of drone strike in Beer on some Russian units, after which he decided to surrender. It happens to be such a practice that the drones themselves bring it. The opponent's drones bring, say, certain soldiers to the point of surrender. Perhaps a similar situation occurred here, since the Ukrainian soldiers felt quite free, without expecting some kind of counterstrike or drone strike from Russian units. In other words, this is the story we have in Severny Volchansk. It is also worth noting the information that was initially made publicly available today, that you clearly understand that, in general, there is an extremely high probability that Russian troops will be able to take completely northern Volchansk under control and repel all possible counterattacks of the Apu in the east from the village of Tikaya, after which, of course, you need to understand that the next step is this will be the Russian side forcing the Volcha River and attempting to take a bridgehead in southern Volchansk. And for these purposes, barrage detachments and advanced lines of defense are already being prepared. In fact, the 153rd Infantry Brigade has been thrown for these purposes, which occupies positions along the Volcha River in order to prevent, let's say, a breakthrough of the defense line by Russian units. Then we are moving with you to to other sectors of the front. So, if we talk about the North Baku direction, there is no news yet. The fighting is underway. The Apu is suffering high losses, according to the summary of the Ministry of Defense. However, well, if we talk about some shots on the ground, about movements, there is nothing to say yet. Extremely important news is coming from the Seversky direction today. To be more precise, news is coming from the area of the village of Rozdolovka. Russian units have been conducting assault operations in the direction of the village itself for the third or fourth day. We remember with you there were many updates of the map by pro-Ukrainian sources, neutral, pro-Russian. So far, there is no clearly unified, let's say, such a policy for updating maps, since one thing appears, then another. Let me remind you, let's say that this zone, according to the pro-Ukrainian dictate, is already under the control of Russian units. However, we see that the control zone goes through several strong points, and it is unclear how it is possible to control the supports in one area in half, or what, which are connected to each other by some one solid line. And Russian sources separately assure that these heights, this network of strong points, is under the control of Russian units. If we talk about geolocations, then we only have geolocation of the approach of Russian assault units to the south, let's say, the western part, to the southeastern part of Rozdolovka itself. The footage was published a few days ago by Ukrainian sources. Today, Russian sources are already showing footage of drone operators working in Beer on farms located in the southern part of Rozdolovka, working on Ukrainian units in squeezing from these farms in order to further capture this territory. If we talk about the western part, all this business took place in the east of Rozdolovka. About the western part, information is also being received today that during the assault measures, Russian units managed to break through the defense line of the Afu and take control of the Rozdolovka railway station. In other words, if we look at the map with you, then this area, which is flickering before your eyes, was taken under control by Russian units during the last, say, 48 hours there. Based on all this information, if we summarize all the news that we received from various sources, geolocation, just posts, then we can conclude with you that Russian units from 3 places have already entered the Rozdolovka. This turns out to be the western section, then the southeastern direction, and also, according to unconfirmed reports, there is an extremely high probability that Russian units blocked the Rozdolovka from the northeastern part. Well, there are 3 directions from where the pressure comes from. But in the near future, it is possible that the Afu will be forced to retreat, and then this front will pass this point, under the full control of the Russian Federation. Then we are moving with you for hours Yar. There are some interesting news coming in today. And this section of the front, this white one that flickers before your eyes, begins with the Borysagovsky Temple and ends, say, with the new post office and two small skyscrapers in the center. This whole line has come under the control of Russian units. It has been cleaned up as much as possible. And this suggests that the Russian side has come close to the Chasiver citadel. That is, very, very closely. All the houses, the entire gray area of the entrance, and the Russian units are ready to continue the assault. The footage of the movement of Ukrainian soldiers in the Yarskaya citadel is published. They move in small infantry groups of 1, 2 or 3 people, no more. And generally unsafe. All the footage shows that, in general, it remains here. In general, the situation is unsafe. Then we are moving with you to the Avdiivka direction, from where a lot of important and interesting news comes. The most important thing, of course, is that Alexandrovka is coming again. For days and days in a row, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation has been reporting on the infliction of fire damage on units of the armed forces of Ukraine in the settlement of Vozdvizenka. This is the most important settlement, which is the extreme, the last settlement between, let's say, the Russian positions, and the main supply route, which goes from Pokrovsk further to, let's say, Konstantinovka, Torets, New York, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk. And this is the most important part of the front. Of course, it is extremely difficult to attack here. This Vozdvizenka, this is where massive blows were inflicted. It is extremely difficult to advance here. And it's not even that it's extremely difficult to attack, but even with a successful offensive, we see that Russian troops are being pulled into a kind of gut, that is, and that can lead, well, to serious consequences, that is, artillery strikes. And it turns out that advanced Russian units will be pulled away from their artillery positions. That is, well, it is extremely important to attack here, of course, from the point of view of the psychological factor. One time. It is extremely important for Russian troops to advance here in order to deepen the breakthrough to. And of course, the third thing is that it is important to attack, so that, let's say even physically, just on paper, at first go to fire control of the same main highway N32, which goes from Pokrovsk further to the east of Ukraine. In other words, this is an important offensive, which, of course, involves high risks. And today's artillery strikes suggest that, probably, most likely, Russian units will move in this direction. Then we are moving with you to the Novopokrovsky Falcon, to all of these Novoselovka the First. Here, Russian units were mainly engaged in expanding the control zone, preparing a springboard for the final assault on Novoselovka the First, the last more or less large significant village, which will mark the fall of the second line, the final fall of the second line of defense, and the exit of Russian units to the third line of defense in the USU in the Pokrovsky direction. Over the past day, the advance of Russian units south of Sokol has been noted, as well as the expansion of the bridgehead between Amansky and Novoselovka first. Footage was published from the AFU of the epi-drone strikes on the units of the Russian army along this road. In other words, we see an expansion going on, pressure from 3 sides, but there is still a certain distance to Novoselovskaya. Novoselovka first, which has yet to be overcome and which, perhaps, will give Ukrainians 3-4 days, let's say, to contain the direction. Then we are moving with you to Krasnogorovka. Gradually, the news from the direction is already accelerating in general. Every day, more and more news frames are received about the next successes of Russian units. Just the other day, we discussed the capture of 2 small buildings in the area of Sumy Street. Today, the entire block of high-rises located along the Sumy region, Sumy Street and north between the private sector, has come under full control. In fact, they control several, let's say, blocks with high-rise buildings, but all of them are absolutely useless for, let's say, conducting defensive battles for Krasnogorovka. Since all the main direction of Russian movement is currently marked, let's say, in the northwest and west direction, that is, here, and here already in front of the Russian units, there are no sections of the front, sections of the city with high-rise buildings on the way at all. All the skyscrapers are left behind, deep in the east, and no one even climbs here. They simply block the VSO unit here, waiting for when they themselves decide to finally leave the area, since there is no point in staying. But there are high risks of being surrounded. Then we are moving with you to the south. Information is received from the quarry, from the territory of the quarry. More and more cartographers confirm the information that the quarry is under tight control. The other day we discussed with you that there is a possibility that units of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade were surrounded in the quarry area, but there is still no confirmation of this. Only small posts by various cartographers about the promotion. Extremely important information is being received today from the Staromayorsky-Rozhnaya line. From Staromayorsky, shots of assault actions are published, more precisely, the further advance of Russian units in the direction of the next settlement, called Makarovka. While the fighting is still underway on the outskirts of Staromayorsky, however, the vector of movement suggests that the movement will continue. According to the Harvest, extremely important shots were published today. In these frames, we can observe with you an attempt to break through by Russian units, let's say, positions in the USU. In the central part, the landing of troops, the movement of armored vehicles, and strikes on columns of Russian equipment using drones. That is, the extreme point that was recorded, the advance of the Russian troops was recorded here, where the first landing was made. And attempts to occupy, there are some underground heating mains or pipes, but the bulk of the equipment moved further north. And we do not know where exactly this equipment was stopped. There is an extremely high probability, and my understanding, that this is such a new one. It's not new, it's a well-forgotten old tactic. Now the Russian units, due to the presence of the same Reba, with the presence of barbecues, in good armor. There are opportunities to wedge in there on 2 or 3 bays with a landing deep, let's say, in the rear of the units. To fly somewhere into some such assembly hall, or into such a building, take such a building under full control. Cut off the grouping located between a given territory, say, the southern part of the crop, from supply by setting up full fire control. Let the disembodied fly constantly. And while Russian units are standing here, the main troops are clearing the settlement itself, self-harvest, meter by meter. Now it was happening in exactly the same way. The vanguards went as deep as possible, took some small-scale significant large building, where they can hold the defense. A large number of Ukrainians were left among these ruins, but literally in every second building, there are 2 or 3 soldiers. And now, while snipers, machine guns, drones and other aircraft are blocked at the top, from above, the main units are clearing building after building, moving in order to connect with the main units in the northern central part. In other words, something like this is happening today, and this of course says first of all that in the near future, everything will be clear in terms of harvest, and in general the battle will end here. As well as for Staromayorskaya. According to the Kherson and Orekhovsky directions of What News. And by the way, so far we have left approximately the same situation as we just discussed with you in the Harvest. Occurred in, let's say, Volchansk itself. Let's go back for a couple more seconds. That is, how is it that Ukrainian sources spread information that Russian units were surrounded in Volchansk? They seem to be burning the truth on the one hand, on the other hand, not quite the truth. The fact is that in the early days, when the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine was not saturated in Volchansk, Russian units during the operation, when there was, let's say, not a solid line of defense, managed to throw 2 companies straight into the plant itself. Well, at least that's what the sources say. They threw them into the factory, and in general, these 2 companies took a circular defense in the aggregate plant itself, and defended in a circle around the perimeter, taking control of up to 40%. And this information was still received in the 20s. This information was confirmed by Pisces, various pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western cartographers. But after that the information completely disappeared from view. We started receiving only geolocations, let's say, from the area here from Korolenko Street, let's say, some institute of Getishinskaya Street, and based on these data, everyone sort of rewound the maps back. Well, they took aggregate, and the fights are only from here. And in fact, I'll just repeat once again, they threw 2 companies of troops into the aggregate, took a circular defense, and waiting until the main units break everything here. There are streets, all houses, and do not connect with the units in the aggregate itself. In other words, the breakthrough itself, the very attempt to unite the troops, went somewhere from the period from the 20th of May to the 1st of June. And the first attempt to establish a connection between Russian divisions, let's say, here on the mainland, with divisions in the aggregate plant took place on the 6th of June. The first 5 soldiers went on, let's say, reconnaissance by combat in order to enter the aggregate itself. But Ukrainian sources report that only one of the 5 was able to get there. Already a couple of days later, on the 8th, 15 people were able to enter the aggregate plant, and on the 13th, 14th, the Emtelboshki, completely stuffed with everything that can be scupped, with supplies, cartridges, were already calmly driving in. All this time, from May 20th to today, 2 companies of the wounded, of course, and the living in the aggregate, were fed with the help of drone supplies. In beer, drones flew at night. Baba Hedgehogs threw off something more serious. In other words, this is the story that actually happened in the aggregate plant. This is such an interesting operation that has been carried out all these weeks, and none. In fact, there was an encirclement, but in the sense that it was a circular defense. And the Russian units consciously went to this operation on their own